Hey guys, Sean here and welcome to the F1 Word. Now at Imola, drivers took to the track for F1's fourth sprint event and once again it was met with mixed reviews. And it actually was an odd one for me as well because I think it was alright, but all I could think throughout was about how these events could be improved in the future. So I wanted to have a bit of a post-weekend waffle and just throw some of my ideas out there about how I think a couple of changes could, emphasis on the word could, help to improve F1 sprint. This isn't a debate about whether these sprints should or shouldn't be part of F1 because, quite frankly, I feel like that's a bit of a pointless discussion at this point because it's pretty clear that F1 is determined to keep these events on the calendar and is even looking to expand them to as many as 6 next year. So they are here to stay. So I think it's important that the sport at least tries to make them as good as they possibly can be. And these are just a few of my thoughts. I'm not claiming they'll solve everything or anything at all. And feel free to let me know how you'd improve sprint races other than just burning them to the ground in the comment section down below. So what would I do then? Well, first up, I'd make them a standalone event. Yes, I know, not a great surprise given I've been banging that drum since pretty much the first one. Having the sprint set the grid for Sunday, I think actually takes something away from the main race on Sunday and also results in the sprint being a little bit more sedate than it could be. And actually, we ended up at Imola with a much more conventional grid for the Grand Prix than we would have had if the Friday qualifying session had set the grid for the race proper. On this occasion, the sprint just allowed faster cars to make their way back to where you'd expect them to be if quali had been a standard dry session. My point being, just imagine how much more entertaining the race would have been on Sunday if the drivers out of position had to fight their way back through the field. Those passes we saw on Saturday would have added to the show on Sunday, if you see what I mean. Then again, I must admit having the two fastest teams right at the front did give us a bit more strategy intrigue, which, as you may well know, is something I really enjoy. The other reason for making it standalone is that I truly believe drivers will be more likely to take risks and go racing more aggressively if the rest of their weekend isn't going to be destroyed by a spin or some contact. What I mean by that is that whilst drivers will make moves if they are almost a dead cert, we are less likely to see bolder moves because if the driver going for it ends up in the side of the other car in the wall or in the gravel, their Sunday is massively compromised. You know, compromised for the race that actually matters and hands out the big points. Make the sprint standalone and not have it set the grid for the race, and the drivers may well be more inclined to race harder. I suppose as an example, do you remember that move that Daniel Ricciardo made on Valtteri Bottas a few years ago at China? We don't see a lot of that on a Sunday anyway, but we're less likely to see it in a sprint because it's not really worth the risk. It's that risk-reward factor, which I'll get onto later. Of course, that's all just a theory though, and in the era of the cost cap, drivers may well be instructed by their teams not to make risky moves in a sprint, just in case it leaves mechanics needing to fit spare parts in time for the Grand Prix. You don't want to get through 3 front wings a weekend. In terms of how that would work when it comes to the weekend schedule though, is quite an easy thing to solve. There are other options. For me personally, having Friday qualifying set the grid for both the sprint and the Grand Prix could work well, although it must be said that could just lead to the same race, but one is shorter than the other if you see what I'm getting at. One option I did see, though, suggested was by Chainbear over on Twitter, and that's to have the result of Q1 set the grid for the sprint, and actually, I really like that idea. It would add another important, I guess you could call it a mini session to a sprint weekend, so instead of having the faster drivers going out and trying to just do enough to make it into Q2, they'd have to hit the track and try to deliver the best lap possible to take P1 on the grid for Saturday, and surely that just adds something else to the show. Some of you may even argue that it could be taken further and maybe FP2 on Saturday morning could set the grid for the sprint, but then that session just basically becomes a qualifying session, so it may as well be called that. Qualifying on a Saturday, that might catch on, you know, what a great idea. Sarcasm, obviously. Perhaps F1 could even look to reverse the top 10 in Friday qualifying for the sprint on Saturday. I mean, after all, the best 2 sprints we've seen to date were Brazil, where Lewis Hamilton started out of position, and Imola, where we had cars out of position. Yeah, it may just be faster cars coming through the field, but it's more entertaining to watch than a procession of cars. Entertainment and the show, of course, being of big importance to Liberty Media. However, whilst I'm not totally against the idea of reverse grids, I can understand why people don't like how gimmicky they could well be. Although I do kind of wish F1 would just try them at least once as an experiment, if you like, because it could well help put that debate to bed forever. Then again, F1's version of a trial is very different to most people's version of a trial. After all, that is exactly what sprint was supposed to be, but it was pretty clear from the first one that it was here to stay regardless. So yeah, for me, the priority is making these standalone events, but there are some other changes I'd like to suggest that might add something more to sprint races, and perhaps some of these will be a little bit more controversial, but they are just a few ideas. How about making them a little bit longer? One thing I've noticed so far is that just as the action really starts to build, the checkered flag comes out and it all falls a little bit flat. I'm just wondering if it might be worth making them something like 50% of the race distance, or even time them like some other series do. For example, in Formula E, they do 45 minutes plus 1 lap, which now I've just said that, given a fair few F1 races are around about 90 minutes long, that would still be half, but you get what I mean. And with it being a bit longer, maybe adding an element of strategy would be cool as well. Something like one mandatory pit stop, but to have it differ from a proper Grand Prix, maybe allow drivers to take any compound they want and not force them to use 2 different compounds. So if a driver, for example, wants to go from the softs to a new set of softs, then that's fine, but they must pit at least once, and that will open up options like the undercut or overcut, for example. Okay, that's not going to make strategy as interesting as it can be on a Sunday sometimes, but it does add another variable and doesn't detract from what we could see when it comes to strategy in the Grand Prix. And how about extending points a little bit further? Having more points available for the sprint would be another reason for drivers, in theory at least, to take more risks, because more points up for grabs improves the risk-reward of making bold moves. But this is actually a tough one, and I was having this conversation with someone on Twitter on Saturday. It's a tough balance to strike because you don't want to see F1 award too many points as that could detract from the race on Sunday, but at the same time, if you don't give out enough points, drivers are less likely to race harder. But I do think there is a balance to strike there. I'm not 100% sure what that balance is, although I did wonder about awarding points down to 10th like in the Grand Prix, but make it 12 for the win, 10 for second and 8 for third, and then 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 down to 10th place. The only issue with that is that whilst at the front there are significantly fewer points up for grabs, towards the back end of the top 10, they're pretty much the same as they would be on a Sunday, and that might end up detracting from the Grand Prix in the end. That's what I mean when I say it's tough to find the right balance. And maybe F1 already has the right balance, but perhaps keep it as the top 8 and look at 10 for first, 8 for second, 6 for third, and then 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 down to 8th place, as it used to be actually when the point scoring system was changed in 2003. And do you know what? Yeah, maybe even award a point for fastest lap, but open it up to anybody and not just a driver who finishes in the points, so that somebody towards the back of the grid has an incentive to maybe pop into the pits, put on some new softs and go for that bonus point. I don't know, it's just a thought, and I'd really be interested to hear what you think and if you've got any ideas for how Sprint could award more points without taking away from the Grand Prix. And just to explain, I do think a bigger gap than 1 point between P1 and P2 is a must in any F1 race, because although, based on the points ideas that I've put forward, 2 points isn't worth taking a mega risk for, the bigger the points difference, the more likely the driver in P2 is to take a chance to snatch the win. As I've said many times already, it could encourage them to take that risk. It's why I really like the Grand Prix point system we have now, the 7-point difference between the top 2 positions. I want to be clear as well at this point, I'm not totally against sprints at all. There have been elements I've enjoyed from some of the ones we've seen so far, and I think if done right, they could add to the show. I'm just not a fan of how they are right now, and as I said at the start, they are here to stay, so let's hope F1 keeps evolving them to try and make them as good as they can possibly be. I know, some people are going to hate them regardless, and that's absolutely fine. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion. But don't shame other people for enjoying something you don't. And that's the other way around as well. Don't shame people who don't enjoy something because you do. We don't all have to like the same things. How dull a world would that be? And apologies if this comes across a little bit preachy. That's not my intention. And I must admit, it's certainly a more F1 Twitter than most of you listening to this. To conclude then, sprints are something that I honestly do believe have a fair bit of potential. Sure, I've been watching F1 for 30 years now, and I'm always going to prefer a traditional qualifying session on a Saturday to a sprint, but I'm not against change, and I'm always going to prefer a sprint to another boring practice session. At the end of the day, I'm a racing fan, and that's what I want to see, racing, but it's got to be done in the right way. It can't just be, let's throw some extra races in and see what happens. They need to get the balance right. Some of you may think my ideas are awful, and quite frankly, you may well be right. But with a few tweaks, some easier than others, like for example, making it standalone, I honestly believe they could work well. And on the proposed increase, by the way, to 6 events next season, I hope that's the cap and we don't see any more than that. I don't want them every weekend, which I know right now isn't the sport's intention, but they do add something different to some race weekends. It's another variable thrown into the mix over the course of the season. So one every now and again isn't an issue for me, but as I've said, they just need a little bit of tweaking. That is it then for this waffle or video or whatever you want to call it, but you can, as always, let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below, and also let me know how you would tweak sprint races to improve them for the future. Once again, everybody is entitled to their own opinion, as am I, so keep it respectful in the comments, please. I'd genuinely be interested to hear some of your ideas. Now, I will be back hopefully later this week with some more content, and then, of course, I'll be gearing up for the first ever Miami Grand Prix. Let's hope they're able to get some water into that fake harbour. Anyway, in the meantime, if you did enjoy this one, then please do leave a like, as it really does help the channel out in its never-ending fight with the YouTube algorithm. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos or streams. But as ever, thank you for watching. I've been Sean, this has been the F1 Word, and until next time, goodbye.